Hello everyone. I am Alice of KHR Arts and Cloud Orchid Publishing, and today we are going to talk about the logistics of book inventory. What exactly does that mean? We're going to talk about specifically what it means to have book inventory as an author. When you actually go to in-person events, book signings, release parties, conventions, etc., you have to have physical copies of your book. Whether it's just to have for display, whether it's to give them away, whether it's to sell them, whatever the case may be, you need to have physical copies of your book. And in order to bring those physical copies of your book to these events, you have to store them somewhere. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is the actual logistics of obtaining book inventory, storing book inventory, and transporting book inventory. This is one of those things that most authors don't really think about when they're getting started as an author. What most people really focus in on when they're working to become an author is about the whole publishing process, and then finally, yay, it's a book. And then there really isn't a whole lot of idea of what to do after that. And a big part of that puzzle is having book inventory. Now, depending on if you're an indie author or you're a traditionally published author, will determine how exactly you get your books, but in practice, it's the same. So if you're a traditionally published author, you're going to have to get your books wholesale from the publisher, and that means you have to pay for them. You actually have to pay for your own books, which a lot of people don't realize that you have to do. Your publisher doesn't just give you books and then you just make money and then they lose money from the cost of having to print the books and ship them to you. You have to pay for them yourself, which is a surprising fact that even I myself didn't think of when I was first starting out, and I was like, wait, I have to pay for my own books. So that is a thing to keep in mind. You do have to make sure that you have a little bit of a nest egg saved up so that you're able to afford to have book inventory, and also to figure out how exactly to price your books, because you need to make sure that you make a profit. You have to buy them wholesale from your publisher, or if you're an indie author, you have to buy them wholesale from the printer, whether that's Ingram or CreateSpace or whatever company you're using to print your books. You're going to have to buy them wholesale. As you can see, the practice is the same. It's just a matter of where exactly they're coming from. And then you have to think about the pricing. So the cost of pricing has to include the price of the wholesale, the price of shipping, and then you need enough in there to make wiggle room for profit. Therein lies the difficult part of this process, is figuring out your price point, because you want to make sure that there's enough profit that you're making a profit, and you also want to make sure that you're not charging too much to where you're pricing yourself out and nobody wants to buy your book because it's too expensive. It's going to take a few tries to figure out where that sweet spot is, so definitely experiment, as well as keep in mind that book prices fluctuate depending on the event that you're at. So for instance, there are some conventions where authors will price their books more or less depending on the overall cost, because again, you have to factor in that overhead of the cost of attending the convention, the cost of the table, the cost of the hotel, all that stuff. So again, you have to make the price a little bit higher so that then it helps cover that overhead cost and you can still make a profit. Whereas if you're doing a small little gathering book release party, or you're doing a small little book signing where there's little to no overhead, you can afford to have a lower price point because you don't have to worry about all this overhead cost that's going to eat into your profit. So it is important to keep that in mind, that you don't want to have your books priced the same price at a low overhead cost event as a high overhead cost event. I mean, you can, but you're probably going to end up losing money, or you're going to end up pricing yourself out of the low overhead cost events because your book is priced too high. The next step is, where are you going to keep these books? So this is also something that I've by trial and error had to figure out as an author, is even if you're doing a small event, you're going to want to have anywhere from 10 to 30 books on hand, depending on how many people you expect to be there to sell your books. If it's a large scale convention, sometimes you might need to have 1,000 copies of your books, depending on if it's a really big convention where you're expecting 10,000 people to be at. That's a lot of books you're going to have to figure out, what do I do with them? And something that I personally do that's really helped solve this problem, and it solves two problems. It solves the problem of how do I store these books in my house? And then how do I transport these books? Every author is different. Every author has their own way of doing it. My personal way of doing it is I got these really big plastic clear tote bins. You can get them from pretty much anywhere. I got them from Target. I stack the books into the bins and I save my bubble wrap packaging materials from whenever I get orders in order to have that like bubble wrap safety to keep the books from shifting around in the bins during transport. And what's nice about this is that these are what I use to store the books in my house, but then whenever I have an event, all I have to do is just take the bins and load them up into my car. I don't have to pack them into a different type of container or change the way that I'm transporting them when I'm transporting them. They're just in the bin. I take them out of the bin for the event, put them back in the bin, and then they go in my house, and then I forget about them until the next event. It's really efficient. It just makes my life so much easier, and honestly, the fewer times that you have to pack and unpack your books is for the better, because it means less wear and tear, less chances of banging them or bending them or any sort of damage. Figuring out some sort of system where it's pack it and forget it is what I highly recommend for both storing and for transporting. Now, this is a good strategy to have if you're driving to these events, if you are transporting everything yourself. There are authors who will do out-of-town events where they actually have to fly to the events. If you're doing an out-of-town event where it requires flying, you can't exactly take a whole bin of books on the airplane with you. What you're probably going to have to do is you're going to have to pack them up and ship them to the event. And this is a whole other headache that a lot of authors deal with, and it's a gamble. Stressful, and you have to really make sure that you understand the timetable for shipping things and make sure that you're communicating with the venue. Otherwise, you could end up doing an event and having none of your books arrive on time or even at all. So how exactly does that work? So what happens is a lot of authors will either pack up books that they already have in their inventory and ship them. And when I say ship them, I mean, via like the mail, UPS, FedEx, whatever service you want to use, that type of shipping. You're mailing them. Or some of them do it directly, where they will directly order the wholesale shipment from their publisher or from the printing company and have it shipped directly to the events. They don't have it shipped to their house, they just have it shipped straight there. Now, the logistics, no matter which way you do it, you have to make sure that you know the timeline of when the books are going to arrive. And you want to make sure that you put in a little bit of wiggle room, because as we all know these days, shipping anything can be a nightmare, and shipping times can just stretch on for far longer than we previously anticipated. So always be prepared, have some sort of backup plan just in case for whatever reason your books don't arrive on time or they don't arrive at all. Some authors have taken to the extreme measure of having a small box of books in their checked luggage just to make sure that they have at least something. And it's not just the shipping of the books that you have to worry about. You also have to worry about making sure that you are in communication with the venue. Most conventions take place at hotels or at convention centers. And you have to make sure that you're talking to the concierge and see, one, do they even have that as an option where you can ship things to this place? Or do you have to have some sort of middleman where you can go pick them up and then bring them to the convention? Two, you have to find out what their rules and policies are on shipping, because some of them have rules where they're only going to pick up the packages between certain times, or they're not allowed to be above a certain weight, or insert any sort of rules here. Make sure you read up on them. Some of them have extra fees that they charge for you to ship things, so you have to put in the expense of shipping them, and then on top of it paying the venue to have them shipped there and for them to be able to handle your shipments until you arrive at the event. And then lastly, you want to have some sort of plan for what are you going to do with them after the event is over. Never assume that you're just going to sell out of the books, because that's not a very good contingency plan, because more often than not, you're not going to sell out of the books. So you have to decide, are you going to ship them back to yourself? Are you just going to, on the last day, give away your books? There are a lot of authors that will do that, where they will slash prices 50% off, sometimes more than that. Sometimes they'll just straight up give away the books so that they don't have to pay the cost of shipping them back home. Some will have them shipped back home, and then you have to figure out how exactly to ship them back home. That means that you have to box them back up, and then you have to decide, okay, is there a shipping service at the event? Does the concierge or the hotel have that ability ability to ship things? Do you have to look up where the nearest shipping place is, and then on top of that figure out what their hours are? Depending on when the event is over, all of the shipping places might be closed. You have to figure out the logistics of all these things, and then on top of it, make sure that you have enough money at the end of the day to ship them all back home. There's a lot of moving parts that goes into being a working author that a lot of people just don't really realize that goes into it. And the logistics of having book inventory can be overwhelming, which is why it's so important to make sure that you have a game plan ahead of time, because it's really not something that you just want to do by trial and error because it's stressful. It's going to cost you a ton more money than you anticipated. And at the end of the day, book inventory is something that can really make or break your future events. I have had author friends who made the mistake of they didn't order enough book inventory and they didn't realize that they have back-to-back conventions, and then by convention number 3 or 4 they've run out of inventory and they ordered a new shipment far too late, and now they're paying for these conventions that they have no inventory for, and they're essentially just sitting there without product. And that's embarrassing, and it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of time. So it's really important to make sure that you have these logistics figured out ahead of time to save yourself a lot of grief. The next thing to consider is the logistics of if you're driving to a location, which is far less headache than having to fly and ship your books, but it is still a lot that you have to plan out. One of the logistics that people don't think about is the size of your vehicle. Do you have enough room in your vehicle for everything that you need to take to the event with you? It's a lot easier if it's a one-day event because you don't have to worry about your own personal effects. But if it's like a weekend convention at a hotel, you're going to have to worry about, is your suitcase going to fit? Is your book inventory going to fit? Are all of the materials that you need for your booth going to fit? You have to fit in the car. If you're driving with other authors, or maybe you have an assistant, or maybe you have a really awesome friend or partner who's coming with to help you have to figure out the logistics of fitting all those things and all those potential people in your vehicle in order to get there and back. And hopefully on the way back it'll be easier. Hopefully you'll have less inventory that you'll have to pack. But again, you have to be prepared to drive home with just as much stuff as you left with, if not more, if you end up buying things at the convention too, which is also very common. So figuring out the logistics of that, of do you have a small vehicle? Are you only able to do smaller events because you only have so much space in your vehicle to be able to transport books? Do you have a larger vehicle? I personally have a Jeep, and when I bought it, I took into consideration, I made sure that I bought the Jeep that had the largest trunk space available, literally just for transporting books and other things, so that when I go to conventions, I have the maximum amount of space possible to be able to transport all the things. And let me tell y'all, I pack that car as tight as a Tetris game. That car is packed when I'd go to conventions, and it's a really large, spacious Jeep. I can't even imagine people trying to cram that much stuff into like a small 2-door sedan or anything like that. It gets complex, and I even see some people where they have so much stuff that they have to bring with, especially if they're a group of people. Sometimes they will rent a trailer that they'll hitch up to their vehicle just to be able to have enough space for all of the things that they need to bring with them. With all these factors in mind when it comes to attending conventions and events, how much inventory not only do you need, but how much inventory you can actually physically transport. And then of course the logistics of how are you going to get those books from your car to the booth. Because another thing people don't think about, an author, they said, it'll be fun, they said. Books are heavy. Let me tell y'all, those bins that I transport my books in easily weigh at least 50 pounds each, if not more, depending on what books are in them. They are heavy. And one of the things that I have that has really solved that problem for me, especially because as I'm getting older, I'm becoming more physically disabled, is a cart. Carts are lifesavers. And I have talked about this in one of my other videos where I talk a lot about the logistics of attending a convention as a vendor. Get a cart. Carts are your best friend. Carts are going to solve so many of your problems. Having a cart on hand at the convention is super helpful because even if events books tell you that they have carts available, or if it's a hotel, sometimes they'll let you use the little bellhop trolleys. Never count on that, because chances are they're going to have a very limited number of them available for use, and everyone is going to want to use them. So then you're wasting a lot of time having to sit around waiting to use one of these carts, and then you have to deal with the logistics of, is it too small? Is it too unwieldy for you to be able to navigate? Is it going to support the weight of the boxes of your books? All of those kind of logistics. And then on top of it, if you damage it, you're going to have to pay the venue for damaging their cart. So it's just so much smarter of an investment to just bite that bullet and just buy your own cart. I guarantee you it is 100% worth the cost, especially with all of the hassle of trying to transport your stuff from your car to the convention and then from the convention to your car. Especially because, let me say it again, books are heavy. Books are heavy. So make sure that you take all of these steps into account with your book inventory. And then, of course, the final logistics of storing your books in your home. So while some people might have the benefit of having a large closet, or even having a basement or a crawl space or some sort of large storage area where you can just put your bins of books and leave them and forget them until the next event, some people who have smaller living spaces have to get a little bit more creative with storing them. As of right now, mine are honestly kind of front and center in the middle of everything. They are directly behind the green screen, just kind of piled up against a wall because I don't really have anywhere else to put them. But with the way that my current living situation is, that's not really a problem for me, whereas for others, it might be a larger problem. Or you need the space to be more modular and have things to be easy to move to be able to transform that space into different uses. Whatever have you, you're going to have to put some thought in where exactly are you going to put these books, how are you going to store them, and if they have to be moved around, make sure that you're storing them in a way that it's easier for you to move them around, because again, books are heavy. I cannot stress that enough. Books are heavy. And I'm very lucky and grateful that with the way that I utilize my space, I only have to move my books if I'm doing book inventory or if I'm doing an event. And that is literally it. It does not matter that I have my books essentially in the middle of the room all the time. That doesn't affect my daily life, and it doesn't bother anybody else because it doesn't bother me and I'm the only one who's concerned about it. The final aspect of having book inventory is doing inventory. Sounds a little bit repetitive, but it's literally sitting down and counting out your inventory. So it's important after every event you do to go through your books and count how many you have and count that against how many sales you had. Unfortunately, theft is a thing. It does happen, so it's good to be aware of if an event has a particularly high theft rate or not, and maybe take that into consideration of whether or not you want to do that event again. It's also important to do inventory because then that tells you, okay, I sold X number of books at this event, and I sold X number of books at the event prior to that, and I have this many more events that I have to do within this time period, so then you can do a rough guesstimate of how many books you're going to need in order to do all of these different events in this time frame, and then you can use that to plan out when you might need to order more inventory so that you don't run out by the end of all of these events that you have to do. And an important thing to remember is there is nothing wrong with having inventory left over that you have to store, because books don't go bad. You can store books for weeks, for months, even a year. I stored my books for basically all of 2020 because, as we all know, there wasn't anywhere to go or anything to do during all of 2020. So my books literally just sat there. And then once I was able to start doing events again in 2021, I was able to start just selling the same books because they're books. They don't go bad. As long as they're stored properly, there's nothing wrong with them, and you can just go ahead and sell them. Any inventory that you have left over from the beginning of the year, you can 100% sell at the end of the year. There's no rules against that. Having inventory left over is beneficial because it means that you do have stuff that you can sell at your next event and not necessarily have to panic order inventory because you have nothing to bring to your next event. And while of course, yes, the dream is to sell out of your books at every event and have a line of people waiting at your booth to buy your book because they love it so much. Unless you're a really well-known author, a lot of times that isn't very practical to expect at most events. It's good to prepare, it's good to know about roughly how many books you're probably going to sell at each event and be able to prepare properly for that. Last but not least, it's a really good idea, especially for tax purposes, to keep a written record of your book inventory. A big part of taxes as an individual creative person, and this is more so for indie authors. If you have a traditional publisher, they'll typically worry more about this for you, but it's also good to keep track for yourself as well. But you have to be able to calculate the cost of the book and then the book sales and all those individual costs. It's good to talk to a financial advisor in order to understand exactly what those numbers are that you're going to need to worry about most. But the gist of it is that knowing how much the books cost wholesale, knowing how much it cost for you to ship them, and then what price points you sold them at, how many you sold at each event, and keeping track of all those numbers is really going to help when you have to do your taxes at the end of the year. So make sure that you keep track of all that. And even for purely selfish, non-tax related reasons, it's a really good idea to keep track of all this information as well, because it tells you whether or not events are worth going to. Now, of course, I would suggest within the first year, probably even going into the second year of doing this, you're going to want to ignore those numbers a little bit because you're a new author and you have to work to get your name out there. And it's going to be hard to make book sales at first because you have to build that audience. But once you've started to establish a brand for yourself and people are starting to know who you are, that's when it's important to really start paying attention to, this is the cost of this event and this is how many sales I made at this event, and then making that educated decision about, is this event financially worth me attending? Now, as I've said in my other videos, there are sometimes other reasons beyond simply profits why it's important to attend an event or not, but it's also important to keep these numbers in mind, because as an author, unless you have a really lucrative day job and you're willing to hemorrhage money, you're going to want to make sure that you pay attention to these numbers and cut events that just really aren't helping you. So I hope this video has been helpful. If you liked it, please be sure to give it a like, and if you're new, subscribe. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.